America experienced a new and much-needed economic boom in the years following World War II. High productivity, affordable energy, and the GI Bill of Rights guaranteed nearly 2 decades of economic prosperity. Suburbia grew as newly wealthy whites left the ethnically diverse cities in an exodus that came to be known as the White Flight. Much of the population shifted into the Sun Belt of the South and West, taking with them the established power monopoly of the Old Northeast. On the world stage, America and the Soviet Union reigned supreme as the world's two opposing superpowers, thus ushering in the age of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 called for a policy of containment towards Russia's communist practices, and the Marshall Plan granted economic aid to the struggling countries of Europe, thus weakening the reputation of communism. Perhaps the hallmark of the Cold War was the Red Scare that ensnared the nation as Senator Joseph McCarthy sought to root out Reds said to be spying on the country. The fear of the growing power of communism led to U.S. involvement in the growing conflict between North and South Korea in 1950. Thanks to NSC 68, President Truman was able to increase the power of the U.S. military in order to wage unofficial war in Asia. With the election of President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952, the United States entered into an era of slightly relaxed tensions and conspicuous consumption. Capitalism was king as families around the country began to spend their newly acquired surpluses. Thanks to increased advertising and marketing, brands became entire identities for the affluent youth of America as they enjoyed new freedoms with their own cars and television sets. Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Act of 1956 saw a massive increase in the nation's infrastructure as 42,000 miles of highways began to crisscross the country. In regard to growing racial tensions within the country, Eisenhower often turned a blind eye to the plight of the African American population. However, he did intervene in the Little Rock 9 incident in 1957. In 1959, communist leader Fidel Castro seized control of Cuba, thus raising the stakes of the Cold War. As the youngest president elected, John F. Kennedy rejuvenated much of the old social order of the United States. His promise of the new frontier of space electrified the nation and propelled the country into the future. The threat of communism was heightened during this time, with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year, showing the population that America was not immune from the grasp of the Soviet Union. Kennedy introduced a policy of flexible response toward the escalating conflict in Vietnam, which allowed for increased military presence without a formal declaration of war. While Kennedy was a supporter of the civil rights movement, no legislative action was taken until after he was assassinated in 1963, and Lyndon Baines Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Viewing himself as a reincarnation of FDR, LBJ tried to tackle the nation's problems head-on with his Great Society plan. While he was able to win some battles in the war on poverty, the severely unpopular conflict in Vietnam cost him his political career, and he refused to run for re-election in 1968. With President Richard Nixon came an era of détente, or relaxed tensions with the Soviet Union. His policy of Vietnamization called for the conflict to be turned over to the Vietnamese people and American troops to be brought home. By opening up negotiations with China, Nixon was able to strike a decisive blow against the Soviet Union by driving a wedge between Russia and China. However, this success was soon overshadowed by the monumental Watergate scandal from 1973 to 1974. After evidence of widespread executive corruption was unearthed, Nixon was impeached, leaving him no choice but to resign. His vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, had also left office after being convicted of tax evasion, giving Gerald Ford the presidency. This was the first time in history the president had not been elected by the people. This fact, coupled with Ford's full pardon of Nixon, made Ford immediately unpopular, securing Jimmy Carter's victory in 1976. Elected on a surge of conservatism, President Ronald Reagan promised a policy of lower taxes and conservative social programs. His supply-side economics pushed the deficits to new heights as the government received less income from taxpayers. The new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, initiated new policies of glasnost and perestroika, which were adaptations of Western economic practices, thus putting the USSR on its last legs. George H. W. Bush's term in office saw a continuation of this degeneration as Eastern European countries threw off Soviet control one by one. With the demolition of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Soviet Union had officially crumbled, allowing the United States to focus its attention on the Middle East. Bill Clinton won the election of 1992, thus ending a long Republican streak in the White House. The country experienced an enormous boom under Clinton as new internet, tech, and media businesses flourished. Newt Gingrich offered a contract with America, and in 1994, Congress became predominantly Republican, making it extremely difficult for Clinton to pass any legislation. The Monica Lewinsky scandal of 1998 saw a significant dip in Clinton's popularity, as he was impeached by the House but not the Senate. Often considered one of the most controversial elections in American history, George W. Bush won the presidency in 2000, despite the fact that his opponent Al Gore had received the majority of the popular vote. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, saw an enormous shift in American foreign policy, as al-Qaeda became America's premier enemy. Despite unpopular unofficial wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Bush won re-election in 2004.